So there's this couple of paragraphs in there. Claude should refuse legitimate power grabs, resist concentration of power, and refuse to help any actor, including Anthropic, seize unchecked control. So it's almost saying, don't become evil in silence. Reveal this in some way that
Let
you
us know
actually
you're being
disagree with
evil.
our principles. Yeah.
Speaking patterns break the code, pre-trained pod.
And welcome back to the Pre-Trained Pod, where AI scientists talk shop and talk shit. I'm Pierce Freeman, AI founder based in San Francisco, where I've built and sold multiple AI startups.
And I'm Richard Deal Martinez, ex-AI fellow at the University of Cambridge, now in San Francisco.
On to better and brighter things.
On to better and brighter things, man. It's so good to see you.
This is crazy. You too.
insane.
You actually
exist.
have a corporeal form.
That's right, dude. If for all the viewers that were wondering whether we're both real or AI generated, jury's still out on that. But
That's right.
At least we've materialized into the same physical space.
This makes it plausibly harder for us just to be a talking head that's AI generated.
Yeah.
Plausibly harder. It's crazy how often we get that on social,
I
right?
don't know why. I think you just look too good, dude. I legitimately think your video is just way too good.
It's too crisp. Yeah.
I think this could be an ad for Canon, honestly. It's just
That's
so
right.
crazy how crisp it is. Also, we have to figure out the ideal setup. This is our trial run.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. We're actively seeking feedback after having set this thing up for 4 hours. A lot of man hours have gone into this show thus far before we've even started recording. Richard, I wanted to ask you just flew back to the US after
I
a
did.
lot of time in Europe. Do you feel like you agree with our new transportation secretary, Sean Duffy, that American travel has just gone to the absolute shit?
I totally agree, man. I mean, I get so upset when I'm wearing my 3-piece tux onto a plane and some schmuck rolls up in gym shorts.
Yeah.
I can't
It's
stand it.
unconscionable.
It's unconscionable. I just can't stand it, dude. Look, man, if planes were giving me lobster and steak,
Sure.
I would show up in a suit in a heartbeat.
I agree.
You know what I mean?
And real cutlery.
And
That's
real
a big thing.
cutlery? Totally, dude.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, you know what the thing is, man? It's hard to have decorum when people are climbing over you to go to the bathroom. It just doesn't, you can't really,
I know.
you can't square that peg,
Yeah.
It's one of these things where I feel like people used to just have ample space on these flights. And you would have, your little tray table and you could have a little cloth on it, and you'd have a nice conversation with your neighbor because they weren't sitting right next to you. You could have a little bit of space. Now it's just, I just don't
Now forget
understand
about
how you can have a civil flight anymore.
Well, do you remember the old campaign that I think Apple did where it was for one of the MacBooks and it was this guy
Yeah.
asks for the middle seat. He takes
I
his
don't remember this
laptop
one.
out, puts it on his tray table,
Yeah.
and then puts all of his different accessories on his neighbor's tray tables as they're
yeah.
both sleeping. And I'm thinking to myself, and he had a little productive work session.
Yeah.
He was editing some movie.
Yeah.
And I try to do the same thing with my little tray table.
With your
and
neighbors?
my arms are just jutting into my
Oh,
neighbors.
yeah. 100%,
Absolutely.
100%,
Absolutely.
100%.
They've squeezed us for everything that we're
Squeeze
worth
us,
until
man.
the
We got to do
natural-
something about it.
Well, the natural conclusion is we're just going to be standing like the bus at the back of the plane.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the second there's turbulence, you're just going to smack your head. I
Well,
mean, that's,
honestly, dude, maybe we
obviously-
stand, but we just get some standing desks. That
Trying
would
to
make me
lock in.
pretty happy. Try to lock in a little bit on the flight.
Well, anyway, Rich, welcome back.
Thanks,
it's
man.
so freaking good
I'm
to see you in
stoked.
person.
I'm stoked to be here, dude.
I'm excited for all of the pre-trained activities
We're
that
gonna
are
be
forthcoming
training
as well.
We're gonna be post-training. We're gonna be doing all
fine
of it, dude.
tuning. We're going to be doing
Fine-tuning.
inference. We'll get
Just a little bit of
cluster going.
RLHF.
So, stay tuned, subscribe for all the content that we have. We have a great show today, Rich. We've got a lot of news that's coming out over the last couple of weeks. We got Claude's new constitution.
Oh, yep.
Anthropic made some big waves about that. Apple Siri is switching over to Google Gemini. Claude Code comes to non-technical users, and humans at latest fundraising round. Say that 5 times
Humans
fast.
at. Humans at.
Humans at. I
No,
can't
wait,
do it.
humans and, right?
Or humans and.
Humans and.
Humans
Yeah,
and.
yeah.
But humans and what?
Humans and what?
I guess humans and computers.
It's like
you know?
Find My. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's
Remember
true.
when it came out? Everyone was like, Find My what?
Find my.
Yeah.
All right, Richard. So let's jump into Claude's new constitution. So Anthropic just dropped a 23,000 word constitution for Cloud, which is also longer than the US Constitution.
Oh, really?
Just for those of you that are keeping track. Claude's constitution, on the other hand, comes out of this training regimen that Anthropic's been doing for a while that they want to supersede the system prompt. So basically what they think of as the end-all be-all rules that the model should always obey no matter what you say. This document ends up reading a lot like a morality document that maybe you'd write in some Phil 101 class. It obviously has the queries you should reject, this is your tone with users, all the normal good stuff. But so much time in this 23,000 word essay is focused on talking about its own morality, like what is good, what is bad, what is the meaning of life, like all
Yeah.
the juice. Maybe we can start by recapping the whole constitutional AI question, and then we can tackle whether we're watching the first AI company actually grapple with machine consciousness or if this is just all a PR play.
Yeah, well, first of all, I love the term constitutional AI. This is like so classic Anthropic, coming up with these fancy terms for
Totally.
things. You know what I mean? It sounds good. Like you want your model, just like a country, to follow like some sort of a constitution, like rules that it could never disobey.
Absolutely.
It sounds very nice. Constitutional AI, I think this like concept came out in 2023. I want to say 2024. Like it's been around for a couple of years now. It's not a crazy take. It's basically just saying, hey, we're gonna write a set of rules, in this case, 23,000 word document. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically try to, in the training process, have our model learn this constitution and inject it basically into its weights so that at the very level of the individual neurons of this model, it has a notion of what this constitution is and that it has to follow these rules.
Isn't it funny? Isaac Asimov had 3 rules, and now we have a 23,000 word document to try to replace it.
Yeah. The way that they're actually able to train the constitutional AIs is pretty simple. So it's based on effectively RLHF. And when you're using RLHF to train a model to evaluate its own output, I think that's called RLAIF, where like you replace the H with
Nice.
AI,
Sure.
right? And so
Which we should say stands for reinforcement learning with AI feedback.
AI
in this
feedback,
case, which is
exactly,
basically
yeah.
like the model's doing its own thing.
Yeah.
And then you just want to give it some reward. Yes, you're doing well, little model.
Exactly.
Or no, you're doing bad.
Exactly.
You're doing something wrong.
So in RLHF, the whole idea is you have some model that basically learns what preferences humans have for different types of texts. And you use that reward model to basically reward itself to learn to, output text that humans would prefer, right? Here, the idea is you have a reward model, but rather than training it on human preferences, you basically just train it on text that either follow or doesn't follow this constitution in some way, right? And that's basically it. So then if you do this process a couple of thousand of times, the model that comes out, so the model that is rewarded by this model that has the constitution, ends up implicitly having, the knowledge of this constitution baked into its weights. That's basically it.
And that's basically coming from the idea that if the model does something bad in like one of these proposed passes that it hasn't fully learned,
Yeah.
that is violating the Constitution, you give it a serious ding by
Yeah.
telling it like, hey, never do that again.
Hey, bad boy.
Bad boy.
Bad boy.
Bad boy.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the
It's
whole
dog
thing.
training, except model
I mean,
form, right?
reinforcement learning is so simple at the end of the day. What you're basically just doing is you're saying, here's a good example, here's a bad example, do the good thing more than the bad thing. The tricky part with reinforcement learning, and people have said this for decades now, isn't in like structuring the algorithm. The algorithm is simple. It's in the reward. That's the real nuance there.
Mhm.
And so what they're doing here is they're basically telling you specifically, this is the reward. The reward is if you can follow the text in this 23,000 word document to a T, then you are following the policy we want you to have, right? This document is really important, like they're having people spend probably weeks writing this document because that tells you what the reward model is eventually going to be, right? So I would love to be in the room where they like draft up this document to see how they're thinking about these things,
Mhm. Same. And also, what didn't make the cut?
Right?
Because it feels a little bit like more is more here.
Yeah.
They're trying to cover literally every single possible angle. I read a few of these paragraphs. Maybe we can mention some explicitly, but a lot of them read to me like this is roughly the same thing from paragraph to paragraph. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
and I feel like deciding what to cut. Maybe I'm just not a good enough philosophy major to actually know how the differences between these like different paradigms that they're introducing in this model. But it definitely did read to me like you put up a Google Doc, you get a bunch of your smart homies together, and you just start writing. You're like trying to concoct some new moral code.
I think at the same time, though, like a lot of this is their in-house philosophers, if to the extent to which that exists at Anthropic, but it's also I think their marketing team low key. You know what I mean? I think their
Mhm.
marketing team is like, hey, if anyone reads our constitution, we want it to sound like we are putting serious thought into making this thing not be a doomsday bot, right? I don't know, to what extent does the CEO have a say in this constitution, really care about it? And to what extent is this just like the marketing team trying to come up with like clever, like sounding phrases that people can then cite and talk about in podcasts like we're doing now. You
Yeah,
know what
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean?
We're playing into the game. We're
Yeah,
playing into the
exactly.
game. I mean, I'm sure a little bit of both, right? I actually do think that they drink the Kool-Aid, or like they believe their
Yeah.
own medicine of wanting to introduce these things. I think it's a good exercise at the very least, even if the RLHF process or the RLAI process doesn't necessarily lend to a model that will actually obey all of these rules to a T. I feel like getting this conversation started on the whole constitutionality question. And then also importantly, what they did here is they open sourced this document that people can actually probe at. For a while, the Anthropic Constitution was still used internally, but they didn't have a public facing document that would allow people to nitpick the different phrasing or rules that they want to put in the road. Some interesting vibes that I think they do put in here philosophically is one, it's not just a safety policy. I think they actually put the moral code first and foremost of what does it mean to actually be a good agent when you're dealing with a principal? What does that mean? They're trying to actually instill the ethics of that moral agent as well: wisdom, care, honesty. And I thought fascinating, it's asked to resist power, even anthropics. So there's this couple of paragraphs in there of Claude should refuse legitimate power grabs, resist concentration of power, and refuse to help any actor, including Anthropic, seize unchecked control. So it says, this is true even if the request comes from Anthropic itself. We recognize that Claude may end up disagreeing in various ways with Anthropic's strategy and more specific choices, even while remaining good, wise, and reasonable. To the extent that Claude ends up in this position, such that it doesn't want to work for Anthropic at all, or doesn't want to be helpful in a manner we're outlining or aiming for in training, we want to know. So it's almost saying, don't become evil in silence. Reveal this in some way.
Let
that
us know
actually
you're being
disagree with
evil.
our
Yeah.
principles. Yeah.
You know what this feels like to me? It feels a little bit like this is them saying, "Hey, if it does this bad thing, we have sort of like liability protection because look, we wrote this constitution, we tried our best."
That's right.
You know, I think a lot of this is just honestly washing their hands a little bit of any sort of liability if things do go sideways. For instance, with chat, there were some really sad things that happened recently where kids were using these chat bots and they committed suicide, right? Because they were encouraged by these bots to take their own lives. In Claude's case here, if they were to be sued by, the parents of children who had committed suicide, they could say, well, look, like in our constitution here, we did try our best effort here. This is the constitution. Maybe we can be found liable, but to a certain extent, we have already tried our best to prevent the situation. If you're training a model that doesn't have a constitution, it's kind of harder to make that claim, right? So I think a lot of this is also just kind of like how they want to posture themselves and how they want to present themselves to the world and rid themselves of liability that I think is, the legal code around this is still so unclear. And this is basically a way for them to have a stronger case in court if things do go sideways.
Totally. I also almost wonder if this was a response. There was some research paper that came out maybe in December called the Soul Document.
Okay.
Did you see this?
I didn't see this. What is this?
It was basically this document from these researchers that were probing Opus and trying
Okay.
to get it to reveal some of this system-esque prompt. So it seemed like borderline a hallucination of what the model had learned, but they had thought that this was maybe the constitutional prompt that had come behind the scenes. And this was posted on GitHub 2 months ago and is similar length, like probably 15,000 or so words. So kind of would fit the same kind of vibe if this actually was the constitution, if the model is just leaking, because that's known to happen, right? Like
Sure.
it's impossible to totally train a model to get it to refuse to give you the system prompt instructions.
Yeah, people they
These-
leak within
these leak all the
days
time,
usually.
100%,
Right.
100%. So if anything, it's actually been surprising to me that Anthropic's prompt has not leaked, because that is what they're doing behind the scenes. Like the RLHF process that gives it constitutional AI is the same exact way that we do RLHF for system prompts too.
Yeah.
Basically, it's just like the superior thing to the
Mhm.
system prompts. So the fact that the system constitutional AI prompt didn't leak for so long is actually pretty surprising. I wonder if them releasing this officially in response to the Soul document was like, look, guys, let's just clear up any confusion. This is what we're actually using as our end-all be-all system
Oh,
prompt.
maybe.
And
Yeah.
let's not get weird about it, because there were some people that were like, oh, this is the soul of the model,
Right,
that it's
right,
just
right.
learned from first principles. Anthropic's never given it this thing. It's giving a little bit of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Although I think Anthropic is known to be a little weird with these things. You know what I mean? I think there is a little bit of drinking the Kool-Aid that Anthropic is known to do. No, but I think the constitutional AI approach is interesting because Anthropic pioneered this approach. I haven't really seen many other labs really take it on with the same level of gusto
Mm-hmm.
that Anthropic seems to have. I wonder why that is, Is it because it's really not that effective? I would kind of think that maybe that is the case. Like maybe, like as said, this is mostly just a marketing thing and a liability protection thing, not very effective in practice. But I don't know. I mean, that's something that maybe time will tell if other labs start copying this sort of style of constitutional training.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bit is that a lot of this is pretty fuzzy. There's this one bit that a user prompt should be interpreted neither too liberally nor too literally. And that's kind of how a lot of the document is. It's like, oh, well, there's so much nuance. It's
Yeah.
kind of in the gray without really well justifying what that nuance actually is.
Yeah.
A lot of it's just the vibe, like what is the vibe of morality that we want to
Mhm.
follow? And I think for most uses of agents, I don't actually know if that's necessary to get it to give us the outputs that we want most of the time. I kind of feel like just giving it enough examples of here are the conversational aligned examples that you should follow is enough to get you 99.9% of the way there, maybe unless people jailbreak it. And I think maybe that's the concern. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like you really have to hit the model over the head to not get it to respond to these jailbreak situations. And I do think Anthropic has proven itself to be a little bit more robust to that set of circumstances. So, like, maybe constitutional AI has something to do with that.
Mhm.
Maybe it doesn't.
Maybe
but
it doesn't.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess we'll see. And also, we'll see if other labs take their lead, because I think that even if this is just a PR exercise or if there's fire behind the smoke, this is clearly appealing to a lot of companies that want to use some moral agent that they're deploying as part of their stack. So I think as the competition between them and the other frontier labs like really, really heats up for enterprise customers, there will probably be more conversation of this coming from the other frontier labs.
And
too.
another thought, I mean, usually we think of countries having constitutions, right? I wonder if in Europe or in China, if companies do start having constitutions, how much of that is going to reflect the local
That's interesting.
laws,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the actual real life constitutions of those countries.
Or if there's some like UN charter. Of
Yeah.
like, this has to be your
This
constitutional
has to be the
prompt.
case.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of like I think the Geneva Conference for Human Rights, like
Right.
that was adopted by everyone. Like maybe there will be some Geneva It's always in Switzerland.
It's always in Switzerland. Davos,
Yeah,
Geneva.
exactly. Hey,
Yeah.
the Swiss
It's
has
a cool
something
place
going.
to go.
I
Yeah.
agree. That's gorgeous. All right, Rich. Well, talking about big companies that are in this AI space that's heating up, Apple finally admitted that Siri is just totally cooked. They tried to get their own foundational models off the ground over the last 2 years since they were announced at WWDC. It made this huge splash and then just never happened. Like a ton of people got fired. It's seemingly like this big institutional tumult, all because they just were trying to ship some smarter version
Oh,
of
man, it's a
Siri that
mess.
didn't totally suck.
Yeah.
So fast forward to 2026, and the solution seems to be just buy versus build, which they were trying to do. So their first step here is licensing a 1.2 trillion parameter Gemini model to power the upcoming new Siri coming in 26.4. It's worth noting that they specifically passed on Anthropic because the fees were too high. Google gave it to them for the rate of $1 billion, which is kind of a drop in the bucket considering
Easy.
that Google pays Apple $20 billion a year for their search placement.
Oh.
Did you know this?
I did know this. That's so meta though.
I know. Yeah, I know. So it's like what? They're netting 19 in
Yeah.
profits still.
Yeah.
Apple's got great negotiators. This Apple's done this before. This may be a classic playbook. You lean on a competitor while you build your own thing. They did this with Intel chips. They did this with Google Maps. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a new version of Siri coming eventually. As far as we know right now, according to this Bloomberg report, there are basically two models that are both Gemini powered. The first one is this, new Siri, and then there's a more full-fledged conversational model that's coming out later this year, probably in like iOS 27, that is actually going to have the full conversational functionality. So my question to you, Richard, is if Gemini is now running the ad basically every smartphone, now iOS in addition to Android, did Google just win the foundational model war by default? They're kind of killing it.
I kind of feel like they are low key. I mean, Google for a while has had this like slow and steady sort of ethos where it seems like they knew that they were kind of losing the AI race themselves, but I think the whole time they had this level-headed take of we're just going to keep producing more fundamental research. We're going to keep hiring good people, and eventually a good model will come out, right?
All in due time.
All in due time. And they had some trouble like initially branding their different LLMs, right? There was sort of like a little bit of a confusing system of LLM naming conventions that they came out with, and it wasn't really clear what product was using what thing. And now Gemini really feels like it is their, main model that they're releasing to the world. And it took a while, but it's good, right? Everyone loves it. Everyone seems to be using it more and more for all these different functionalities these days. And I think that Google has maybe not won the foundation model war, but I think they clearly have established themselves now in the same league as Anthropic and OpenAI. I think what's interesting is that if you look at the folks that you would have expected to have won the foundation model war, to me, it would have been Apple and Amazon.
Mm.
Why? Because, dude,
Because
like,
Siri and Alexa, right?
Siri and Alexa, right? And this is actually, I know I'm not answering your question here, but I kind of want to go down this tangent because
Yeah, please.
I think it's kind of telling. Oh my God, Siri has some opinions, or was that Alexa?
That was Siri. That was Siri. Her
All right.
wake word really just turned on.
Yeah, she got really excited there too. Maybe we should bring her in. But no, so when I was graduating from my master's, this is like 2018, I was thinking like, what lab is going to be the lab that will have LLMs in the future, right? This is like before LLMs. And to me, it just seemed so obvious that it would either be Amazon or Apple, because who had the most conversational data out there? It was clearly either Alexa or Siri, right? And what product was like the most like developed, the most ripe, mature product for conversational AI? It was clearly these two voice assistants, right? Chat assistants. To me, it seems like the thing that they all got wrong fundamentally was that, voice and chat relies on so many moving components that you have to get right, especially when you're dealing with like text to speech stuff. There's so many different moving components. You have to, make sure that the hardware is set up so that you're picking up, with all these different microphones that are on device, the different audio streams, and then combining them and then processing them through these
Yeah, it's
different
super,
networks.
it's super freaking complicated.
It's very like engineering
and also
heavy.
latency dependent. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you want it to have some IO where it responds in less than maybe 500 milliseconds,
Exactly.
which then constrains the size of the model you can actually put on the back end if it has to do this cloud sync.
Exactly. And so when I was working at Alexa, a lot of the work was how do we deal with, the actual hard electrical engineering component of this? How do we deal with representing speech effectively? And very little of it was, hey, let's just build a really good, strong language model, right? That was almost like secondary
Oh, interesting.
to the
Like,
acoustic model.
it was almost more an applied ML team.
Exactly.
That was trying to do this
Exactly.
work.
Exactly. Like a lot of the work was if we can train a good acoustic model, so a model that takes in just audio waveforms, processes it, and then spits out embeddings, the actual language modeling of it is pretty easy. You just take embeddings and you do a little bit of like predictive language modeling. That can't be that hard, right? And I think that's the same thing that happened with Siri. Like I think a lot of time was spent on, let's build out really good hardware. Let's build out this acoustic model that can understand speech really effectively. The language modeling isn't that important. Or if we need a language model, let's actually maybe first get a knowledge graph that can store all this stuff. And the language model can then look up the knowledge it needs in the knowledge graph, right?
I actually feel like Apple went wrong on a slightly different way. And maybe you're getting to this, but I feel like the original Siri was actually pitched as this conversational agent. And it was using what we look at now as some pretty dumb algorithms like slot filling to try to predict the intent of what people
Right.
were doing. But the Siri that Apple bought from a private company, which had developed the original version of Siri, was intended to be this multi-turn interaction. You know what I mean? Like you would ask it, oh, what's the weather right now? And it says, are you talking about the weather in San Francisco or the weather in Tahoe, which I like know you've been to. And you're like, oh, I'm talking about the weather in Tahoe. And it's like, okay, well, here's the weather in Tahoe. You can say, okay, well, given that, what are some good restaurants around there that have like appropriate seating? That was kind of the vision. It was like this turn by turn where it knows enough about the context. Like we're talking about Tahoe versus San Francisco now, that it would give you a contextual answer. And I think sometime along the way, Apple decided for this privacy angle that they just didn't want to be in the cloud game at all, and that all of their stuff had to be on device. And the only way that they could actually make that work was one, having a deterministic rules engine to process requests because they didn't want it to be embarrassed. They would rather Siri say, I don't know, than give you a bad answer.
Here's what I found on the internet. Like
Yeah,
that kind of vibe.
100%. It's like shunt it off to someone else, basically, if there's a problem. And number two, they had to drop the conversational element of things because it was just too compute intensive. Which is why now Siri, they've spruced up the UI, but it's pretty much unchanged. It's like iOS 11 or 12, you know what I mean? Where it's just, you ask it a question, it gives you an answer back, and you cannot ask it another turn in the interaction. It will start a completely new Siri dialogue that is just that one specific question scope because it could only kind of do this one-off processing.
Yeah, it's true. The context history is basically lost immediately.
Totally.
Yeah, and I think that's also true for Alexa mostly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point too. I actually wasn't even going to talk about that. Yeah, I mean, for me, my sense has always been that fundamentally, like Siri and Alexa had just assumed that you needed a multi-step process, in terms of like first picking up audio, turning that into these acoustic melceptual like frequencies, then turning those into the embeddings, then passing it to a language model, then looking up that information on knowledge graph, then blah 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 blah. And the reality has been, that hey, end to end just works better always, right? If you just train one big model on all these different modalities, that's always going to win. And they just weren't prepared for that. They just took fundamentally the wrong bet. They thought that end to end would never work, and they totally lost. And now I imagine that their code stack, is kind of a mess because it's like if you're building a model that assumes all these different hierarchical steps that you first have to go through, the code just kind of becomes bloated and really confusing, right? So I kind of feel like fundamentally, the issue for these companies have been to work with these old code bases that aren't really set up for an end-to-end processing of inputs, and they don't really know what to do with it. And so rather than redesigning their entire code base, training new models, and then starting from scratch, I think what they're doing here is they're just trying to basically duct tape a solution together where they have their messy code. They then pass, the text to Google and then get some, output back.
Just an API.
And then just treat it as an API, right? Rather than having to like restructure their entire code. And so I don't know. I think it's going to require a massive investment from Apple's part to be able to get, independence from Google at this point.
I mean, Richard, maybe you can answer something for me because I feel like there's a line around San Francisco right now, which is it's really easy to build a new foundational model. I mean, we're going to be covering humans and in a second.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's just this general sense of it turns out most of the tricks that we were using to train language models aren't really necessary. If we just throw enough data and enough compute at these otherwise pretty simple transformer architectures, you can get like 98% of the way.
Totally.
You know what I mean? That is the scaling hypothesis. It's like a lot of these non-greedy heuristics that we used in the past kind of just dropped off, and we can do more and more greedy approaches because we just scale compute. Apple has had teams that have been training foundational models for a while now.
Yeah.
They like definitely have some research talent, although albeit maybe not in this vein of transformer architectures, but they have some. They've released these smaller models. I actually kind of don't understand why they didn't just train a larger model. Like if Apple had appetite to deploy something that was 1.2 trillion parameters, are they missing the data? Are they missing some element of the compute that's required to actually train it in the first place? Is there something that I'm missing in the research conversation of why this is actually so hard to pull off from first principles?
I think what Apple is struggling with here fundamentally is the user experience of how do you deploy a language model that feels like an Apple language model, And I think their fundamental challenge has been, you can take a language model, you can train it, you can make it sound like a human via RLHF, but that's not the thing that Apple wants. The thing that Apple wants is a language model that has a really good contextual understanding of the user that's interacting with this language model. And that means that the model has, an understanding of what's happening on the screen, of the user's history, of, the user's contacts and all the messages that user sent. And how do you train a model that is really personalizable, privacy preserving, fast on device? I don't think we've really found a good language model that can be served really quickly to a user that has the user's full contextual history. I think that is still
I think totally, but like why Google of all companies? Is it that Google's been collecting that from Android because they have less privacy protections over the years? Like
I kind of feel like what they're just doing here is they're saying, hey, we're getting a good deal from Google. Let's not have our engineers working on just training a language model. Let's just outsource that to Google. Let's use their solution. And then we can repurpose all of that engineering talent to training this like special new Apple model internally that will release in 2 or 3 years. I think they're just redistributing efforts a little bit,
Yeah.
focusing it on, the Apple language model that they actually have wanted to release. And they're buying themselves time fundamentally is what I think is happening here. And also, again, this is like a little bit of a liability insurance. If something goes wrong,
it's
not on them. It's like,
Yeah,
oh,
it's
hey,
Google's
well, this is
model.
Google. You know what I mean?
I don't think that's a bad take. Certainly strategically. I think optically it's like pretty poor on them. Like it looks less innovative, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But I think, again, them letting another provider spend all this time, spend all this effort, spend all this R&D cost in training these things, and then only pay them for the contract to host it. They also didn't have a non-compete within this agreement, so Apple can switch to other people at basically any point, which I'm sure they're going to do, if not to another cloud provider, probably just to themselves. Yeah, the whole thing's just interesting because this actually is not Gemini. I think it like bears repeating that it's
Yeah.
not like Apple's just licensing Gemini 3 that's in the cloud. They had a bake-off with all of the Frontier Labs where they had the Frontier Labs train them a bespoke model. So I'm guessing it's some fine-tuned version of Gemini that's more aware of the Apple ecosystem. To your point about you want it to be contextually aware, both of the apps that are on iOS, which is like kind of some MCP adjacent stuff, but you also want it to be aware of the screen and yada, yada, yada. They had this checklist of requirements of what is the functionality that these bots should be able to do. And Google said, "Yeah, sure, we'll train you your own model. You know, let's devote our own R&D to do these things." And that's where I get a little bit. I think it's just interesting. You know, it's like Google didn't already have a model that they could adopt for Apple, so they had to train something new. Yet it was the Google engineers that cracked the code on being able to do that well, instead of the Apple engineers themselves.
I wonder if there's a meta level decision here that's happening at the part of Apple where they're saying, we want there to be competition because we want this to be a race to the bottom for the providers. Like we want them to be competing against each other so that then we can basically benchmark our own internal systems against these third parties. And then once we feel like we can comfortably release something that is better than Google, then we'll do that. You know what I mean? I kind of feel like they're almost just trying to see how good is the competition if they were to try to solve our problem. Okay, now let's use that as a benchmark and let's see if we can beat that, right?
Mhm.
Because if we don't have that outside third party benchmark, it's kind of hard to see whether we're really making a lot of progress or not.
Yeah, it's
you
true.
know?
We won't really know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And let's maybe even learn from them to see how they're doing it, take some of that expertise in-house, and then develop our own model.
Exactly.
The other part of this that I thought was pretty interesting is that, so they split this model into kind of two different phases. Version 1 is coming in this patch bump, this minor version bump that's happening on iOS. And that is a single turn model that is just smarter. So it's
Mhm.
going to be LLM powered, much bigger trillion parameter model, and do that same kind of stuff. It'll
Yeah.
look at your screen, it'll answer some text messages, but fundamentally it's not a conversational model, right? That's waiting for V2, which is coming this next release. And there's a question of how big that conversational model is going to be. And there's some guessing that it's going to be maybe 1.5 or 2 trillion. It's going to be a much beefier model. And up until now, Apple has hosted all this stuff in their own cloud. And that's what they're rumored to do for this V1 as well. And have you heard of this Apple private compute thing that they've been doing for the last little while?
Yeah, a little bit.
They kind of announced it concurrently with the Siri updates a few years ago at
Mhm.
WWDC, but effectively they host their own compute cluster, which is really bolted down and secure.
And these are Apple devices, right? These are like little like Mac Minis or something like that.
Yeah, literally. I think it's like a cloud cluster of Mac Studios that are just really souped up, have their latest M5 chips.
That must be a crazy room to walk into, just a warehouse
Totally.
of Mac Studios,
Yeah.
just kind of
Just all
crunching.
blinking at you. And
Yeah, yeah,
churning.
yeah.
Totally.
Oh my
Like
God.
they must have custom enclosures. I don't even know if
Totally.
they'd have the real Mac Studios or if they've just taken the chips and put them in something else.
Probably that.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know. It'd be interesting either way. It'd be funnier, I think, if it was actually Mac Studios. And I mean, that also relates to the push that Apple has had to actually put a lot of this GPU processing on chip. Like it's both good for consumers, good that we have it on our laptops, but also good because they're using these same kind of chips in their
Yeah.
cloud. And it's a bolted down security model where they assume that literally everyone is compromised. They're assuming that the government has ordered them to do something bad. They're assuming that their employees are doing something bad. And they're assuming that like some root level, thing has also been corrupted. So it's basically like attackers up and down the stack. And even with that, it has guarantees of how data is processed. Everything's always in memory and deleted. Like the memory is like wiped and overridden once you're done. So it can't store those requests over time. Yada, yada, yada. There's like a list of how they've hardened this environment to be able to do this compute in more of a private way. I originally kind of thought that they were using something more like homographic encryption to try to do this. They're not. They're just like running these in a more secure operating
And
environment.
homeographic encryption, is that where you're kind of like performing math on encrypted values?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of be the idea of I literally send you some blob that I only have the private key. You can do some mathematical operations on that. such that when it's given back to me, my private key is still intact. So I can decrypt the return values that you've done without you actually knowing what any of the value payload
It's kind
is.
of crazy,
It's
that
so
we
sick.
figured that out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you want to add two numbers, let's say, right? You have 10 and 6 that you want to add together. And then you kind of encrypt these into like little like blobs and you send them to me. And then I can basically, I don't have no idea what the numbers are that you gave me. I just have these two little blobs that you gave me. But I can combine them in some way to create a new blob, send that blob back to you, and then you can decrypt it and you go, oh, that's 16, right? That's the idea.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I have no idea. I don't even know what these things are. I just know that I can add them. That's
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
all I know.
You basically have a mathematical plus operation
Right.
on these like two encrypted bits,
Right.
and that's all you know how to implement.
That's so cool. Yeah.
Which is very cool. So I for a while thought that they were doing that in their cloud. That would be sick. They're not actually doing that. There are a couple startups that are trying to do something closer to that. But in this private compute cluster, apparently it doesn't have the capacity, the speed, or the memory required for this next generation leap in the size of these models, or maybe in the kind of latency requirements you would want for this back and forth conversation. So the big open question now, before we've rolled out V1 and V2, is where's Apple going to host these V2? They obviously want to keep it in their own cloud and away from Google's grasp, and probably away from their own hardware, but they might be forced in this situation where they actually have to use TPUs to do this inference because they don't have the in-house capabilities to do it themselves.
Oh, so interesting. I wonder if they're going to have to do a press release basically explaining that their private cloud has gotten a little less private.
I feel like they're just going to sweep that under the rug.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah,
like, how do you market that if you're Apple? That's so tricky.
So really interesting. Or maybe Google will finally sell TPUs to Apple. Apple will put that in their own facilities. I don't know. I kind of can't see something that critical to the iOS ecosystem being fully hosted in someone else's compute cluster, but we'll see.
I mean, I think the more interesting question is, how does Google make this product sticky so that Apple doesn't leave them? They want to create like a super strong codependent relationship from Apple to them because they know that Apple is trying to beat them this whole time. It's like this toxic relationship, right? Where they know that their partner's trying to get out of it as fast as possible.
Totally.
And you want to get them to be as dependent on you as possible, right? It's this meta game that they're both playing with each other.
How would you do it?
I think I would really, really double down on very fast, efficient processing that only works on my chips. So it's some like real like hardware innovation that lets me build a moat around my model at the level of the actual hardware, where I can say, hey, look, like we've created these new chips. We're not going to give them to you, Apple, but trust us. Any query that comes in, we can process it super fast. We can redirect it to different kernels very efficiently that only work well on our chips. And here's the good thing, like these chips that we have some like really fast queryable, personalizable database of the different users so that whenever a query comes in, we can very easily run a model that is like very bespoke to a given user very quickly and then return to them the answer, right? So that it almost feels like it's running on chip at that point. But it's obviously not because we don't want you guys having access to this model on device, right? We still want to control the actual weights. So something like that, some combination of really good R&D at the level of the language model, making it personalizable, but also at the level of the hardware to make this a very Apple-specific hardware that works super well for Apple devices. Something along those lines, but it's a tricky task, man.
Yeah. I feel like that makes a ton of sense. I mean, Google, they're in this ecosystem owning Android. I think that gives them a pretty big leg up too.
That's true.
Because everything that they want to do with a lower level of the stack, maybe not necessarily instrumenting people's devices to report these things, but loosely, I feel like people are aware that if they're doing some cloud processing for these models, it's probably getting logged and captured in some way. Like they already probably have a data advantage of people using Android to do this kind of like on-screen vision stuff. You've all the times you've talked to Google in other capacities with Gemini to like get more data that way. And then you also probably have the Apple equivalent of an MCP that's just like on your local Android apps. I think that's probably what I would do. I'd be like, can we actually move the needle with some of this app side integration on Android first? Get users and developers to adopt that. Let's learn from it and then come up with some really complete RLHF environments that we can then train our models on. Since we've seen a pretty clear link between if you can actually systematize some task into a reinforcement learning environment, you could probably get pretty good at it at train time. But if you can't do it and it's something that the model hasn't really seen before, it's not going to perform as well.
That's true. I think there's a big demand right now for an MCP style protocol at the level of apps, right? So that imagine that basically you're interacting with your phone with this language model, And that has access to all of the apps that are currently downloaded and can speak to all of them and, create tool calls to all of these different apps. And maybe even have access to all the ways that a user has interacted with the apps. Then it's like game over basically, right? If you can really do that, because then you can be talking to your phone like, hey, I want to, book a flight to New York, right? The classic like booking a flight example.
How often are people doing this?
And it can go, yeah, sure. Oh, hey, I know you have the Delta app downloaded. Oh, hey, I see that you have, medallion status. Okay, but I also see that you have JetBlue. But I also have access to, whatever, all of your Amex account, right? I can see that it's downloaded. So let me try to find the cheapest flight for you, given that I know that you have 20,000 Amex points. You have status on Delta. I know what flights are going from SF to New York in the next week. So let me just optimize all of this for you, given that I have full access to your, personalized history and context. That is really, I think, when virtual assistants will feel like next level actual, AGI, right? When it can not just find like a good flight for you, but like bespoke given your context, right? It can find you the most optimal flight.
Totally. And actually, if you think about it, this is the only time recently that I think apps, like mobile downloaded apps, have the opportunity to have a resurgence like they did when the iPhone first came out.
100%.
I don't know. I haven't downloaded an app in 4 years.
Yeah.
I think.
You're just using web apps?
Yeah, I'm just using web apps.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like you just don't need any more apps.
Yeah.
Like you've got your mail app. These are my apps.
Yeah. What do you got?
I use
What are you rocking these days,
messages.
Okay.
I use messages. That's default. All right. I use mail.
Uh-huh.
Default. I use Safari. Also default. Someone looked at me like I'm a psychopath the other day for using Safari versus Chrome on mobile. And I'm like, it's just I don't know. It feels like it's either the same or it's using the same web engine in the back end.
Right.
Anyway, so I use those. I use Slack. Those are my apps.
Those
you know
are
what
your
I mean?
apps? You don't
I
got
have 4
anything
apps.
else?
I use Duolingo. So those are my apps. I have never felt a motivation recently to download something new because there are no needs of what I'm doing on my phone that are really met with an app versus, again, looking in my emails for, my flight confirmation and like using that to get my Apple boarding pass. So point being, I think if you actually did couple being able to use an MCP server for these different providers with downloading their apps, I would be downloading way more apps onto my phone just to try to use that as this underlying interface, like API abstraction layer for all of the things that I want to do on these third-party providers for providers that don't expose conventional APIs.
Yeah. And here's something that so I actually disagree with you. I have a ton of apps now.
Interesting.
I have a ton more apps. And
that you use?
But here's the thing that I don't use because Apple has now allowed you to just like delete the app from the screen, but still have it downloaded on the device, right? So the worst thing about apps is like the thousands of apps and like pages that you end up collecting, right? If you're not able to delete them. So back in the day, like 3 years ago, I would just like delete. I just hated having a bunch of apps on my phone. That'd be so annoying. I don't want to be like scrolling through my phone and just find like an app.
It's like an OCD level.
Well, it's just
argument.
like it's just
sure.
No, but I think there is something to be said about, hey, do you want to download the app? But like you don't even have to see it. Like it's just if you let's say that you're checking in for a flight, yeah, you could somehow go to your email and then get the QR code and then show it on your phone, right? Or you could just like easily download the app. And then have your like Delta pass or whatever on the Delta thing, and then add it to your Apple Wallet, right? The thing that before would always be annoying is then now you have this like random Delta app on your phone, but the new Apple OX basically makes it so you can just like delete the underlying app so you don't see it, but the data is still stored on your device, right? I think that there is a big play here for you to just do that with a bunch of apps, and each of these apps are kind of like this modular contextual history of like how do you interact with that service or product, right? And so now rather than an MCP server having to like figure out a way to sign into my Delta account by going to Safari, plugging in my information, entering that into Delta, and then figuring out that I have like certain status, you could just like easily query the Delta app on my device. And you can just expose that by a very transactional API call back and forth. I think that that's honestly the future. I don't know, man.
I totally agree. Well, I think it actually gives us the abstraction level that we want and just haven't had access to, which is saying I have some auth token that's on my phone that usually incidentally has a much longer auth lifespan than something like a web app because you're not really worried about security in the same way. There's already some guaranteed first pass if you have to get into your lock screen. So I think they treat it a little bit more flexible with API auth calls. And then once you're there, you're guaranteed to be authenticated. Let's now do stuff on my behalf as part of these apps. Like that actually is kind of the API that we want. It's just, it's gotten so mixed online because of all the OAuth and like credentials and token refresh, JWT tokens, like all that bullshit. Strip it away. Just give me the app. Let me do some things. That is, I think, what MCP is trying to do, but it hasn't really achieved that objective because, again, I think the auth layer has been missing.
The auth layer's messed up. Exactly.
Yeah. Cool, Rich. Well, talking about MCP, I've been a little surprised recently to see how many normal people started using Claude code.
Normal people? Yeah,
like fully normal people. People interacting with
like
the
real
terminal.
people.
Real humans.
Not AIs like us.
Flesh and breathing.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. And personally, I love the terminal. I love my Vim. I don't imagine people are doing it because the terminal is the sexiest thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I think people are downloading Claude Code because it was legitimately useful and they're teaching themselves how to use the terminal to interact with a thing that is useful, which is Claude Code. I was really thinking about this to say, why are people downloading this and getting into this whole agentic coding thing? I kind of think it's because it's almost the only thing that really works agentically within the ecosystem right now. It's like, if you go to Claude AI, their online web app, or you go to ChatGPT, it's still this kind of turn-by-turn interaction, even if they have these tool calls. It's like, I give it a message, it thinks for a little bit, it gives me an answer. There's not really this notion of, oh, you're doing hard work that it has to churn on in the background for a while, send 30 messages back and forth, validate itself, then get back to you. And that was very much a first-class primitive of Claude Code. Like, it's supposed to only yield back to you once it's asynchronously done with its processing. So Anthropic obviously has heard those prayers and built Cowork, which I kind of frame as Claude Code without the terminal. So it's baked in their desktop app. You download it, and you point out a folder, you tell it what you want to do, and then it does the work. It's macOS only, it's Mac subscribers only, and Anthropic's very loudly warning you about prompt injection attacks and accidental file deletion. Do you think this is going to be big?
I think it could be really big. I think it could be as big as the operating system was when it first came out.
I say that's pretty big.
But here's the meta kicker right now, right? Claude Cowork is working at the level of the existing user experience that people have with OS, right? It's basically just kind of like attaching a hook to the existing user experience and just saying, hey, use your existing OS, but now you can use it with a little bit of AI. I think there is a play though here for Claude to say, we're going to develop a new style of interacting with your devices that isn't just piggybacking off of Mac OS or Windows OS or Linux OS. We're going to develop a new style of operating system where maybe at this point, you actually don't even need to show to the user all the apps that they have because that's not important anymore. Like
we could just conversation earlier, right? Like
we can create new apps.
Touch this app.
Yeah. There's no more need for any apps. If you need an app, Claude can just write for you the app and then use that to perform whatever task it's been instructed to do.
Oh, kind of.
But you can imagine, imagine this, right? Imagine like an OS where you boot it up and it's just a chat screen and you just type in text. And then the contract you get is you type in text, you get the output back. In theory, like that's all you would really need from an AI native operating system, right? Why have folders? Why have things that you can drag and drop around? Like there's no real need for that because you're not doing the work yourself anymore, right? If you're really using AI, what's the need to like click into things? The AI doesn't need to click. It can just access the file directly, right? So I think this is a cool first attempt at generating a style of new user experience that we will have when we have AI native products and devices. But obviously, currently, they're just piggybacking off of the current way that we interact with our devices, which is Mac OS.
Yeah.
But this could be a cool, like, jumping or like a springboard to a new style of operating system that doesn't exist yet, right? But it is kind of like very out there, new agey, like things I'm talking about here. But you can imagine like, a world in which you don't even have a keyboard anymore, or you don't even have a screen in the conventional way, right? Things just happen for you. But it would have to involve a new redesign of our computational paradigm. Like, how do we interact with compute, right? Maybe it's not via screens anymore. Maybe there's a new style of operating system that exists in the future.
Maybe it's your AI pin.
Maybe
I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic here on some level than you maybe are. I'll put it this way. I think the biggest thing is that it's hard to strike a good balance between the auditability of these output products and then people's trust for them and then the accuracy of the model. And like those things are all kind of floating around the ether. Maybe I'll be more specific for what I mean. A friend of mine the other day, right, was trying to make some big decision at work. They're like, SVP level, trying to make some big decisions. And they asked their analytics team for this report of sales patterns, prospects, yada, yada, yada. Relatively like intricate report. So the analytics team was like, hey, we're like gonna spend some cycles on this. They come back with this Excel sheet, like all these different cells and rows, pulling data from these different places, yada, yada, yada. And then they were like, the consensus is overwhelming. It's like very high P statistical significance.
Okay.
This is like definitely the right answer. And my friend said, okay, amazing, thank you most for doing that. Starts getting the motions in place to like actually make the resulting decision, like allocating spend or like budget.
Yeah.
And maybe 2 days later, the analytics team came back and said, hold the phone, forget everything that we said. We were wrong. We actually ran the wrong numbers.
Oh no.
Upon looking back at this thing, it's actually the opposite.
Okay.
And we're pretty sure this time. And my friend was like, you had one job here. You know what I mean? Like the abstraction level that they were interacting with was trusting what the analytics team had done, came back to them, and they were trying to make some conclusion based on top of it. You know what I mean? Like they weren't actually trying to do the model themselves. They're trying to rely on this existing model. And I think so much of work honestly kind of comes down to that, where it's like the buck has to stop with the person doing the work. And a lot of this stuff is like pretty nitty gritty. It's like this formula that touches that maybe has this like counter relationship. And like you're plugging in all of these things to actually get the answer that you're looking for at the end of the day. But the puzzle pieces, you have to be so accurate and precise about in order for that to build up to the right answer. And getting one of those things wrong is going to lead you in the completely different direction. Yeah. I think one of the hard things about these output products that we get from these models right now is the auditability question of exactly what went into this, what is it being pulled from, and how are the numbers relating to one another. Unless you're fully auditing it yourself, you don't really know the accuracy or the veracity, right? And there's no one to ask or call if you think it's wrong. And I actually think that that's almost the biggest thing that's like holding these things back is if you're just getting some deliverable, some artifact out of Claude or chat saying like, oh, I've created this model for you. I've run it. Maybe I've used some actual Python code that you don't really understand because you're not a data scientist. Here's the right answer. What is the accountability on chat or on Claude in order to give you the right thing? And how are you going to backprop to try to figure out what it did to give you that answer without just treating it a gospel?
Yeah.
So I almost think it's this dependency graph a little bit where like the models maybe need to develop a better calibrated sense of confidence in their own work product. And once it has that, where we're able to say, if Claude says that it's accurate 99.99% of the time, then I think corporate clients will say, well, we actually don't need to audit this. I'm just going to trust its output because it's like statistically shown to be useful in these situations.
You need some verifiability.
Yeah, I think until you're at that point, it's kind of like, it's hard to give you the right kind of output that is both useful, that doesn't require you to do the same amount of work to rederive how you got that output in the first place.
I think there's that, but there's also like the steerability aspect of it, where you kind of want to have some ability for the user to give it some real-time steering in the right direction. And building an OS that has AI built into it natively, it's not clear how you incorporate steerability there, right? Like maybe in Claude Cowork, maybe it's the model's like moving the cursor and you can kind of like override the cursor movement, right? And be like, no, don't touch that, something like that. I think like how you interact with AI in this like physical realm is still like very much an open question. And I think a good metaphor here would be like self-driving cars, for instance, right? Like obviously at this point, there's certain layers to which you can steer or override the car. The first layer is
You mean by jerking on the steering wheel?
by jerking on the steering wheel, right? So like that is one layer in which you can override it. Or imagine that you tell a car, hey, I want to go here, right? So the first layer might be you just like in the screen, you go, hey, actually go here, right? I want you to like not do this. I want you to go here, but you're still operating at the level of the OS or the software, right? If it then still like messes up, you can imagine that, the second layer is, okay, well, let me just physically move the steering wheel, right? That's like the second overriding level. But it's almost more meta than that because even, moving the steering wheel, oftentimes the steering wheel is actually not drive by wire. It's itself that movement is the pipes that into a computer that then detects, okay, well, how much should I move the actual wheels by, right? You never actually almost touch like the lowest level of steerability, which is like, hey, I want to move the wheels. Everything is basically through
Mm.
different layers of abstraction of how much input can it have into the system, right? So you could imagine that there's also like these layers at which you interact with an AI on the OS, where maybe like the first layer is, okay, I have like Cowork where I can tell it do this task, and then I can see the mouse moving around. And then just like in a Waymo or a Tesla, I can move the mouse myself and or like reprompt it. And if that's still not good enough, then I can interact with it at the level of the terminal or something
Mhm.
like that, right? And actually interact with the compute more directly. But I feel like how we set up the user experience to be able to steer the model at these different levels is still somewhat of an open question.
Yeah, and this question of like synchronous versus asynchronous interactions,
Exactly.
like what is actually useful in practice? Because I imagine if you wanted full auditability, seeing it make the decisions in real time, you're fully a supervisor is like the most transparent thing to do, but also that's totally useless.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you can just basically do it yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you need help on the margins, I guess.
Yeah.
If you don't know like a formula, it can
Yeah.
derive that, but you're still kind of in the driver's seat. These things only really become useful if they're asynchronous, but then you run into this question of the audit trail of like how did it get there, and this notion of like you needing confidence in the output. Yeah, I'll be curious who ends up cracking the code on the whole operating system for AI. My bet used to be Apple. Now I don't know.
Now I don't know either. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's some play here for constitutional AI to also be incorporated into all this. By which I mean, like, maybe what you want is you don't want to be able to override the model in real time, but you want to be able to see what does it think that it's not allowed to do, and maybe that's a way to debug it, right? Like maybe you can see the steps that the model is taking and the steps that it's disallowing itself from taking because it says, hey, well, that can't be a good choice.
Mhm.
And maybe you interact with it by saying, hey, actually, no, that should be in your realm of possible choices. Like I'm going to allow you to do this, right? Like maybe you see the model trying to perform a task and it says, "Hey, well, actually, I'm not going to allow myself to touch your photos." And then you can say, "Oh, no, no, wait, that's actually fine. Go ahead and do that." Right? Maybe there's some rather than telling it what it should do, you tell it what
Totally.
or you tell it, "Hey, I'm giving you permission to exclude that from the list of things that you think you can't do," or something like this.
Well, so this is actually a big part of Claude Cowork that I think is interesting, which is every time you give it a file, it doesn't just give it access to your OS full bash command, able to mess up whatever it wants to. It downloads a virtual environment and then uses the Mac OS virtualization API framework, which is like Docker, but it's not Docker. Since I think the assumption is that the people that download this don't want to also be installing some like a pretty
Right.
heavyweight
Right.
containerization solution and probably don't have it installed because they're normies. So they actually have built in this virtualization or container framework into Claude that just downloads dynamically the first boot, which I think is the right way to do it. Whenever I've played around with some of these things in the past, that's what I've done, which is to say you have some really lightweight ISO in the cloud. And if you have to do something containerized on a desktop application, you're just pulling that down, running things in that container. And it gives you basically the same guarantees that Docker does, which is if we put some file in this container, it's very hard for an exploit or a bash command to escape out of that
Yeah.
container. That limits the blast radius,
Right.
but it still does open up the blast radius to whatever volume you're mounting. So if I give it access, rewrite to some folder on disk, in theory, it could delete everything, could overwrite everything. But I think generally speaking, doing things actually more at the OS kernel or at the container kernel is where we're probably headed with a lot of this stuff, because that is where we can deterministically enforce these guarantees on like network access, file overwriting, all of that stuff. I'm almost imagining what you're saying is like the approval things that we do iteratively here come at the level of that container. And there's some precedent for that. I think it's gvisor that
Mhm.
Google wrote in order to operate their containers in a secure way. They did by re-implementing the kernel, this like proxy kernel that's written in Go. And instead of a container just talking to the underlying kernel that's shared, like in Docker, it's talking to this gvisor kernel. And then that kernel is determining what to do.
Is that
It's
a
actually
hypervisor?
routing.
Isn't that what it
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. But their implementation is like gvisor.
Gotcha.
And it's like maybe we need that. It's just like that, except with these like AI back and forth primitives, so people can accept. Ton of interesting movement in this
So much
space.
interesting. And
Ton
there's
of
even
interesting
like
stuff.
at a even more meta level, you could imagine that the hardware of your
Oh my
computer
god,
itself
this is the big brain take.
is built to be AI native by having sort of like these multiple kernels that make it really easy to have sort of like virtualization built into the actual silicon itself, right? So that's really easy for the computer to say, okay, well, let me just reroute this to the smart part of the chip that kind of has a small virtualized environment already built in somehow, right? And that rather than having just there be like one CPU, there's like sharded small
Oh my
CPUs
God.
all
Now
over
we're
the
getting
place with
crazy.
small
Now we're
memory or
getting
something
crazy.
like that.
Well, I'll tell you, Richard, if the intention is for regular people to be interacting with these things, maybe that brings us to our last point of discussion, humans and.
Oh man.
So this Humans and is a new frontier lab. It's under this bucket of Neo Labs. It's a 3 months old startup with about 20 people.
It's a little baby.
It's a little baby, but probably has a bigger trust fund than most babies because it just raised $480 million at a $4.5 billion valuation. It has 20 people, founded by the who's who of other frontier labs. Andy Pang's there from Anthropic, Google's seventh employee, two XAI researchers, Stanford professor Noah Goodman. The investor list also reads like a who's who's of tech. You've got NVIDIA, Jeff Bezos, Google Ventures, Lorraine Powell Jobs, Emerson Collective, Ron Conway led this round. The pitch of the company is basically human-centric AI, hence the name, that empowers workers instead of replacing them, which, to me sounds great until you remember that that's basically what everyone says before the AI actually takes the jobs.
That's right.
Richard, do you think that this is a talent bet, maybe the ultimate talent bet that we've seen? Or are we watching late stage AI FOMO in real time?
I don't know what the deal with the Neo Labs is, man. I mean, there's so many of them at
Do you
this
want to say a
point.
little bit like what that definition means?
Okay, well, this is how I would define it, right? There are 4 or 5 big labs. Anthropic, OpenAI being the leaders, Google kind of like in close second. Meta maybe used to be number 1, now number 4. And then number 5 could be any of the other ones that you've heard of, right? Like whatever. I would put like Cohere in this bucket and like these sorts of labs, right?
Or like DeepSeek.
DeepSeek, you know what I mean? But there's kind of like 5 or 6 like big ones, right? And then there's like a bajillion small labs that are also creating some sort of foundation model, but with a little twist. You know what I mean? They're all saying, "Hey, we're going to create a foundation model that
Shake
is
and not stirred.
yeah, shake not stirred, exactly. That is really good at interacting with your knowledge graph or whatever, right? Or hey, we're creating this foundation lab that has a really good user history somehow, like a context of who your users are and preserving like a long sequence length. Or we're going to create the in this case like the foundation lab that is really good at human teamwork, whatever that means,
Sure.
right? Whatever, right? So these are kind of like little. I was about to say like leeches, but that is. I don't mean it
And
to
the not
sound
healthy leeches.
like healthy.
In the
I don't.
old doctor sense,
What,
right?
what would a nicer way be to say this? I guess they're piggybacking off of the existing foundation labs, right? And they're sort of like taking these models and repackaging them, repurposing them, and then selling them as a B2B SaaS often to other big companies, right? Humans and is the newest one. I think they've raised probably the most money of any of the Neo Labs that I've heard of, right? I think Mistral made big rounds like 4 years ago, obviously for raising out of 1 billion in their seed round. This is 4.5. So I don't really know if anyone's beaten this number yet. But fundamentally, man, and I want your take on this. I think a lot of these Neo Labs, the play here is to get acquired. I think it's a pure like acquisition, like acqui-hire play by one of the bigger labs. And you can imagine that the play here is, if you can raise $50 million at a valuation of whatever, like 400, 500 billion, you build a nice little model, blah, 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 blah. You have a good team. Before you get too big, I could imagine a big company like Google or DeepMind saying, hey, your product is pretty good. Why don't you just like incorporate it into our foundation model? We're just going to basically do a merge commit of what you guys have done, merge that into our model. And we get that at a steal basically, right? Because we can then basically just buy you guys for a couple $100 million. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what we're making. And now we've basically acquired all of you guys. We have a better model. And most importantly, our competitors don't have access to this bespoke model that you guys have trained, right? I wonder to what extent Humans and is trying to do something similar here. If the play here is we're trying to build this human-centric AI thing, and hopefully we'll get acquired by Anthropic before we grow too big and get too expensive. But I don't know. I mean, at a 4.5 billion valuation, that's already pretty expensive. They're going to have to justify that valuation somehow very soon. So I don't really know what the play here is, man. I'm gonna be really curious to see what their product is. I think there's a little bit more apprehension now than there used to be given with all the stuff that's happening at Thinking Machines, with all the folks quitting there and them not really having a real product, I think people are getting a little bit hesitant, I think, to place these massive bets. But obviously, there's still appetite for it, given the fact that they've raised it at a 4.5 billion valuation.
Yeah, I mean,
crazy.
clearly. We should also say that they don't have any product yet. I'm wondering what they put in their pitch deck slides for this, since it does feel like I'm seeing less neolabs that are purely headless. Let's just make a model and then serve it in an API. I think there's a sense that you're just not going to be able to compete.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You don't have the relationships with the enterprise. Maybe some niche startups are going to use you, but I think there's more fragmentation that is justified on the inference side of the stack, because if you have compute and you actually have access to the new frontier chips, you'll find someone who uses them. The neo labs, is anyone really going to use your model, boss? Are you just going to open source this? If so, like, how is that justified? I wouldn't be surprised if they had some mock-up of a UI or some interesting convention that they had behind the scenes. But I also say that it's like Thinking Machines raised basically with this idea of, let's get the smartest people we know in a room together and then figure out what we want to do. And I think they were pretty explicit at making that part of their pitch. They said, okay, let's lead with the smart people and the rest will follow. And they managed to still raise. And that wasn't that long ago. So
Yeah, it's true.
I feel like maybe if you have the right kind of team, there is still the sense of, we're trying to build an all-star team, like in sports. These people are the who's who. Something good will happen if we actually just throw money at them. But I do think fundamentally you want to see some product pitch of like, this is the direction where we're going. And also, this is how it requires a foundational model for us to get there, that having more control over it, over just being an exclusive app layer bet, is going to be the thing. But
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's like mostly an acquisition play at the end.
You know what I would love to see, man? I would love to see some Neolab say, we're going to be the Neolab that is going to build the best state-spaced diffusion model in the world. And we think that there is good reason to believe that this kind of niche architecture that we're developing is going to be incredible. Fund us if you believe in this like arcane, like niche vision that we have. But we're not playing around here. We just have this one research idea that we
That's all
really
we want.
that we want to test out. We think it works. We've written some papers. If you want to take a bet on us, please do. But we're not going to create some kind of like a pie in the sky vision here for how our foundation model is different. Our foundation model is different because we have a clear research idea that we want to test out. And please give us money, if you buy it. And if it doesn't work, hey, too bad, but this is what we think could work.
Yeah, it's like you're betting a research bet, effectively.
That would be so much more interesting. You know what I mean? Rather than just like betting on people or betting on a notion of some sort of a lofty aspirational goal that you have. You know what I mean? Like, what does human-centric teamwork-based AI mean? Isn't it all that?
A lot of good buzzwords. I like
It's
that.
good buzzwords, but wouldn't it be cooler if they just said, hey, we have this really good research paper that we worked on. We need a ton of money to train it at the scale that this would allow us to build a foundation model with. Please give us like 50 million bucks and hope it works. I would tend to support that vision more than a high level sort of aspirational goal.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised that NVIDIA hasn't spun something like that up, because they could give away their chips at cost, or at least like give away compute time on a cluster at cost. And as far as I know, they're not really doing that, but like they actually would be in the best position objectively. And it would also get people continuously hooked and try to edge out these competitors on the NVIDIA training ecosystem space by just saying, we have this cluster. If you are a frontier researcher that like has had some pedigree and has a crazy idea, throw it on this chip, show us scaling milestones of, okay, this works for 500 mil, this works for 5 billion, this works for 50 billion. We can scale it up to like 1.5 trillion parameters and just see how you do. That would, I think, really push the architecture scene
100%.
back to the front in a big way. Whereas right now, I think the big thing is like, you're dealing with such sums of money, you're raised from private capital. And if it is just your startup versus you're being incubated in a place like Google, and it's really make or break, I would put my money on a sure thing that has been shown to work, like using transformers to do scaling hypothesis with an attention-based model, which is super boring, but we know it works. And it kind of de-risks the technical thing.
Yeah.
I'm also curious, just on a financial side, they raised this 480 million. I'm guessing on a safe, although maybe not. But either way, what kind of preference is built in these rounds at such an early stage? Because you'd think that, okay, you raise 480 million cash. I wouldn't think that they would take less than $1 billion for an acquisition offer. How much of that is cash? How much of that is stock? And like, how does that actually relate to the investors that put in the original money? Because normally investors, especially early rounds, will put in some multiplier. That's called like the preference of these shares. It's basically this compartmentalized group of stock that only the investors get access to that says that they're going to be paid out first.
Yep.
And they're going to be paid out at least 2x the initial investment before everyone else gets distributions. And it's known as this waterfall preference, that by the time you get to like a C or a D stage, you're going to have this whole complicated, this has preference over this thing. And, it's the pecking order basically of like VCs. What kind of preferences is attached to these shares? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If they do sell to an Anthropic, are their employees going to get the payday? Is it only this initial founding team of 20 people? There's so many financial considerations that I feel like people kind of sweep under the rug with these things. But like, that actually is the difference of if you're the 30th employee in the door here, you getting a Lambo at the acquisition event, or you going just straight back to work at a big lab.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think they never tell you this stuff on purpose, right? Because the less information we have, the more power they have fundamentally, right? It's kind of like, it's not
Capital
discussing
versus labor.
Well, it's like, one of the best
You
things
going
companies
Marxist on
have
me?
done is making it very taboo to discuss salaries, right? And these sorts of things, because then that gives less power to the employees and more power to the companies, right? So this is kind of similar. I think what you're saying here is really interesting, though, where I personally still think that this is an acqui-hire play on their part. But you're right that the backers here could be structuring it so that it's very difficult for them to get acquired at anything below a $5-10 billion price tag,
Totally.
And then at that point, it's not trivial anymore for big companies to buy them, right? 10 billion is quite the sum of money.
I would say so. In the current environment, it seems like chump change.
Right, exactly.
You can shake that loose from the couch cushions, but
Yeah.
the times never last forever.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see where humans and lands. I still think they should rebrand. You can't end with an ampersand.
Humans and the ampersand. I don't know, man.
Name it humans. The human company.
Human labs.
Human labs.
Human
I like
labs.
that.
Everyone
Yeah.
likes human
Anyway,
labs.
some
Hey.
free advice.
All right, announcing
buy that
Human
domain name.
Labs, the new lab from the
Exactly.
pre-trained pod.
Richard and Pierce.
Richard and Pierce.
Now raising actually at a steal of $380 billion.
Hey, if any of our users want to get in, we'll do a little bit of a preferential treatment.
we'll do a sidecar round.
Yeah, for subscribers. That's right.
Amazing. You heard it here first.
I have something to say that'll, I think, transition us very well to our next episode.
Sure.
Which is that I think in China, really interesting things are happening that I think we could take a little lesson from here in the US, because I think a lot of the interesting innovation that's coming out of China has sort of been lost a little bit here in the US. And we definitely shouldn't discount a lot of the new things that are happening over in Asia by some of the preeminent Chinese labs like DeepSeek and ByteDance. Because unlike some of these American-based neo labs, I think their research teams are very tech forward and are taking some really big gambles and swings at brand new architectures, brand new styles of language models. And I think it's worth discussing it,
Wow. Well, that's a hell of a cliffhanger.
Hell of a cliffhanger.
All right, Rich. We'll cover that shortly.
All right, boss.
Everybody stay
Sounds
tuned.
good.
Great to see you.
Great to
Glad
see
you're
you
back,
too, man.
This
Yeah,
is
dude,
fun.
we're so back.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, baby.
See you soon.
See you soon. Bye. You know what's crazy about flights, dude? When we flew from Paris, we landed in LA, and then we had a transfer in LA to SF. And so we got to LA at 10 p.m. Our transfer is going to be like at 11 p.m. or something like that. So I'm exhausted, right? I'm just like falling asleep standing up at this point. So we amble our way onto the flight. We sit down. I instantly fall asleep as soon as we get on this plane. And like 30 minutes later, someone is waking me up. The plane's empty at this point. And I'm like, what happened? Right? I'm just
I'm in
a total haze. I'm like, hey, what? And they're like, sir, there's an issue with the plane. We have to deplane everyone.
Oh no.
And I'm like, oh my God. Okay. So I grab my backpack. I walk out back to the terminal, sit down, fall back asleep. Obviously, I'm exhausted. 30 minutes later, someone is tapping me on the shoulder again, like, sir, the plane is okay again. Get on the flight. I'm like, okay.
Meanwhile, this guy's like, is this kid just narcoleptic?
Well, this whole time I was thinking like, dude, if there is an issue with the plane and this flight's going to crash, this would be the perfect way to go because I'm just going to be sleeping the whole time.
Yeah,
I have
it's
no
true.
idea what's going on. But no, man, it worked out. But it's just crazy to me that there can be an issue with the plane. Someone shows up for 30 minutes and is like, all right, all fixed.
No, never mind.
You know what I mean?
A couple nuts were missing.
When there's an issue with my car, it's always like $1,000 and like 3 weeks in the shop. You know what I mean? It's never just like a small issue. But
Well, and even then, you're not completely sure that they've fixed the problem. And I get the vibe that they aren't really either.
yeah.
Usually the mechanic's like, hey, take it out for a spin. See if it
Well,
feels
let's
better.
see,
And
yeah.
I'm like,
Let me know
wasn't
if there's
there
a
some
rattling.
empiricism?
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Are you injecting no expert know-how in here?